It's that £1,000 million on which we started to negotiate because we want the greater part back. But it's not asking the community for money, it is asking the community to have our own money back.
I mean, the case was absolutely cast iron.
From the outset of our membership, we felt that we were paying too large a share.
It was perhaps one of the first times, by no means the last time, that people realised that they had perhaps misjudged what modern Britain was like and what it was about.
It was the worst-tempered summit Mrs. Thatcher or any of the other leaders has attended, and even when they gathered for their usual team photo, the glumness seemed to show through. By 1 o'clock there was almost a complete breakdown, and strenuous efforts were needed to get a compromise between the French and German leaders on the one hand and Britain on the other.
I always remember her banging the table at the 1979 European Summit in Dublin, when I actually asked her the question, what is this really about? And she said, Mr. Palmer, it is about getting my money back, banging the table. And then that was the moment I realised that this had a kind of ideological significance quite beyond the figures.
It is asking the community to have our own money back.
There are times when diplomacy requires a tough stance, and the rebate negotiations were certainly one of them. They were trying to roll her over. They were trying to roll her over, actually, with a lot of male chauvinism, and she stood her ground. Good luck to her.
After repeated rebuffs by General de Gaulle, Britain finally joined the European Economic Community in 1973. Most of the community budget was spent on a common agricultural policy. With a relatively small farming sector, Britain didn't seem to be getting much back for its money.
The French had fixed things in the meantime so that the CAP was in a form which was extremely advantageous to France and not very advantageous to us. And the arrangements for budget contributions, the so-called own resources system, again had been fixed by the French in a way which meant that we were going to make an above-average contribution.
What everybody knew at the time was that Britain was going to pay more into the European Union budget, like Germany, compared with what it got out. But the argument was, and this was in the public domain, don't worry about that. We will make such a killing on the export markets that the premium payment of getting into the club by paying in more to the budget than you get back is well worth it. What went wrong was that the British policymakers hadn't realised the extent to which Britain's competitiveness had declined through the 1950s, 1960s, so that when Britain did join, actually they were disappointed in the success of British industry. So that left the budget payments looking as though they were unacceptably large.
And it became very obvious, which really stayed with us for the next 2.5 years when I was Foreign Secretary, that we would have to do something about the financial arrangements, because after the initial period, it was coming out, the arithmetic was extremely bad for Britain.
In 1979, the British budget deal was up for review, and Britain had a new Prime Minister with a distinctive approach.
Schmidt of Germany and Giscard of France set out to bully her, and they found that actually wasn't very successful, and she really was the Iron Lady.
Digging your heels in to the extent that you have right up to the last minute of this meeting, do you think that you've lost yourself friends in Europe?
Well, I hope not. But I have to dig my heels in. What Britain is being asked to contribute is unjust, inequitable and unacceptable and totally unfair to the British people.
Instead of growing our way out of the imbalance in the budget pattern of payments and contributions, under Margaret Thatcher, it became a kind of jihad, a kind of holy war.
I tabled a proposal in Brussels in February, asking for a return of 2/3 of our net contribution, and that wasn't at all popular, as you can imagine.
Meetings of EC leaders and their foreign ministers came and went, with little progress for Britain. Then, in Brussels, a breakthrough after an all-night session of talks.
We emerged with Lord Carrington and Sir Ian Gilmore, and I emerged rather pleased with ourselves because we'd got a lump sum for 1980, 81, 82, which actually amounted to about two-thirds of for our estimated net contribution. And Lord Carrington and Ian Gilmore set off for Chequers, where Margaret Thatcher was. I gave them a couple of bottles of champagne to keep them going on the plane, and then when they got there, they found that she wasn't pleased at all, and it took them all day to persuade her.
But it was a temporary solution, and by 1983 the rebate issue was back on the agenda. Another summit, this time in Stuttgart. Britain wanted a long-term solution, and its diplomats had devised a new formula based on increasing the share of value-added tax revenue on which the community budget depended. But first they had to persuade Mrs. Thatcher.
After about, 2.5 hours argument, she said, "Oh, well, all right, you draft something for me to say tomorrow, and we'll look at it at breakfast at 7. So I drafted something for her to say the next day, and she approved it after going through it very carefully. Always went through it line by line.
Then they just had to win over their European partners. In March 1984, they assembled in Brussels for some full and frank exchanges.
The talks went on late that evening, again in two sessions, because the heads of government had their formal dinner together and then tackled it after dinner as they normally do. I don't think there was any real understanding or wish to understand it on the part of our colleagues. Margaret Thatcher struggled pretty hard, and we, foreign secretaries, didn't make much of a job of tackling it either. We adjourned before the heads of government finished, and most of our colleagues were going off to sleep. I said, looking like a wartime waiting station in Crewe Station.
Undeterred, the British pressed on to the summit that June in Fontainebleau, convinced they had the right formula. This time the French proved keener to listen. Was it the chemistry?
It was really de Gaulle who stopped Britain joining, and it was a great tragedy. Ted Heath came in and had a very good relationship with Pompidou, and that definitely helped. And Thatcher, well, she didn't really have a great relationship with anyone, but there was a sort of wary regard from Mitterrand.
The rapport was very important because we weren't going to reach an agreement unless there was a sense of common purpose. And at that time, certainly, I think every head of state was anxious to promote their national interest, but there was a wider realization that we should try very hard to reach an agreement for the sake of the European entity.
Or was the President simply mindful that the impending arrival of Spain and Portugal could make France herself a net contributor to the EC?
I mean, they offered her 50%, and she said no. And then the French, much to the Germans' fury, offered her 60%, and she said no. And that was when we had this famous pause.
It was at that point that Margaret Thatcher and I and our officials, David Williamson and Michael Butler, went into a great conclave about it.
We just sat there. And after a bit, she looked at me and she said, "Well, it's time to settle, isn't it, Michael?" And so I said, "Yes, I think so. If you can get just, get the percentage right, we've got the mechanism." And she nodded her head, went back in and did the last bit.
But Mitterrand offered us 65%. And I thought we were getting pretty close to a settlement by then. But Margaret said, no, not enough. And Mitterrand again said, right, we'll have to go back to the council and persuade our colleagues there. And that was the crunch.
When they went back in, and Mitterrand offered us 65%, And she said that it would be very helpful to her politically if she was got one more percentage point, and he gave her 66.
President Mitterrand said there were no winners or losers, but he was quick to claim one victory. The French presidency had settled the problems, the 9 were now 10 again, and the community could go forth and expand.
We've got 66% of a certain gap between what we put in and what we get out. It's not quite the whole amount, but it's 66%, and it will last much longer than any previous agreement. It is very complicated. I'm so sorry. It's full of jargon, but I assure you it's a reasonable agreement.